The 1964 movie Zulu is my favourite movie of all time. It tells the story of how just over 100 British soldiers defended the small station of Rorke's Drift in 1879. But as great as this film is, it is somewhat incorrect, and the real battle was far more dramatic. Rorke's Drift was a mission station of the Church of Sweden and the former trading post of James Rorke, a merchant from the Eastern Cape of Irish descent. It was located near a ford on the Buffalo River, which at the time formed the border between the British colony of Natal and the Zulu Kingdom. On the 9th of January 1879, the British No. 3 column under Lord Chelmsford arrived and encamped at the drift. On the 11th of January, the day after the British ultimatums to the Zulu expired, the column crossed the river and encamped on the Zulu bank. A small force consisting of B Company, 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot, under Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead, was detailed to garrison the post, which had been turned into a supply depot and hospital under the overall command of Major Henry Spalding, 104th Foot, a member of Chelmsford's staff. On the 20th of January, Chelmsford column marched to Isandlwana, approximately 6 miles to the east, leaving behind the small garrison. A large company of the 2nd and 3rd Natal Native contingent under Captain William Stevenson was ordered to remain at the post to strengthen the garrison. This company numbered between 100 and 350 men. Captain Thomas Rainforth's G Company of the 1st Battalion 24th Foot was ordered to move up from its station at Helpmaker, 10 miles to the southwest, after its own relief arrived, to further reinforce the position. Later that evening, a portion of the 2nd column under Colonel Anthony Durnford arrived at the drift and camped on the Zulu bank, where it remained through the next day. Late on the evening of the 21st of January, Durnford was ordered to Isandlwana, as was a small detachment of No. 5 Field Company Royal Engineers, commanded by Lieutenant John Chard, which had arrived on the 19th to repair pontoons that bridged the Buffalo. Chard rode ahead of this detachment to Isandlwana on the morning of the 22nd to clarify his orders, but was sent back to Rorke's Drift with only his wagon and its driver to construct defensive positions for the expected reinforcement company, passing Durnford's column en route in the opposite direction. The movie begins with Chard already at the station, building his pontoon, and that Bromhead was in command, with no mention of Major Spalding. In reality, it was sometime around noon on the 22nd of January 1879 when Major Spalding left the station for Helpmaker to ascertain the whereabouts of Rainforth's G Company, which was now overdue. He left Chard in temporary command. Chard rode down to the drift itself, where the engineers' camp was located. Soon thereafter, 2 survivors from Isandlwana, Lieutenant Gert Ardenarf of the 1st and 3rd NNC and a trooper of the Natal Carbiners arrived, bearing the news of the defeat at Isandlwana and that a part of the Zulu Wimpy was now approaching the station. In the movie, Lieutenants Chard and Bromhead have a moment where they decide upon who should take command, with the decision of superiority being upon who was commissioned first, but the movie gives the wrong dates. The movie says that Chard had received his commission in February 1872, making Bromhead the junior officer and second in command at the drift. And it is stated that Bromhead received his commission only 3 months after Chard, when in fact it was a full 3 years after.
All right. What's the date of your commission?
Now, don't tell me. I suppose you have seniority. 1872, May.
1872, February.
It was actually on the 14th of July 1868 that Chard received his commission as a lieutenant, while Bromhead was promoted to lieutenant on the 28th of October 1871. Michael Caine portrayed Bromhead as a pompous aristocrat, ignorant of military matters, but the real Bromhead was an accomplished boxer and cricketer for the regimental team and was popular with the men under his command. During his career he developed hearing problems which became progressively worse. However, according to the historian Ian Knight, contrary to popular belief, Bromhead's deafness did not affect his ability to command his men. Nevertheless, Bromhead was not highly regarded by his commanding officer, who privately described him as hopeless. But the biggest misjustice of character would be Private Henry Hook, played by James Booth. He was wrongly described as a thief, a coward and an insubordinate backroom lawyer, a historically inaccurate portrayal. Hook was actually a teetotaler, Methodist preacher and model soldier. Further to this, he had been awarded good conduct pay shortly before the battle. His elderly daughters were so offended at the way their father had been depicted in the film that they walked out of the premiere.
One of my men, Hook. Do you know him?
No.
In the hospital, malingering under arrest. He's a thief, a coward, and an insubordinate barrackroom lawyer. And you've given him a rifle.
Or arguably, the biggest mistreatment was the role of Padre George Smith, an army chaplain who is completely ignored in the film. Smith played a supportive role in the defence, where he distributed ammunition to the soldiers and offered words of encouragement. Otto Witt, played by Jack Hawkins, is depicted as a middle-aged widower, a pacifist and drunkard, who has an adult daughter called Margareta. In reality, Otto Witt was aged 30 and had a wife, Elin, and 2 infant children. Witt's family were 90 miles away at the time of the battle. On the morning of the battle, Otto Witt ascended the large hill near the station and noticed the approach of the Zulu force across the Buffalo River. Far from being a pacifist, Witt had cooperated closely with the army and negotiated a lease to put Rorke's Drift at Lord Chelmsford's disposal. Witt made it clear that he did not oppose British intervention against Ketcheswaya. He had stayed at Rorke's Drift because he wished to take part in the defence of his own house and at the same time in the defence of an important place for the whole colony. Yet his thoughts went to his wife and his children, who were at a short distance from there, and he did not know anything of what was going on. He therefore left on horseback to join his family shortly before the battle. Upon hearing of the defeat at Isandlwana, Chard, Bromhead and another of the station's officers, Acting Assistant Commissionary James Dalton, held a quick meeting to decide the best course of action, whether to attempt a retreat to Help-Me-Car or to defend their current position. Dalton pointed out that a small column travelling in open country and burdened with carts full of hospital patients would be easily overtaken and defeated by a numerically superior Zulu force, and so it was agreed that the only acceptable course was to remain and fight.
You mean your only plan is to stand behind a few feet of mealie bags and wait for the attack?
That's right. We wait.
Chard and Bromhead directed their men to make preparations to defend the station. With the garrison's 400-odd men working diligently, a defensive perimeter was quickly constructed out of mealie bags. This perimeter incorporated the storehouse, the hospital, and a stout stone kraal. The buildings were fortified, with loopholes knocked through the external walls and the external doors barricaded with furniture. The men defending Rorke's Drift are of the 24th Regiment of Foot, in the film described as a Welsh regiment. However, although it was based in Brecon in South Wales, its name was the 24th, the 2nd Warwickshire Regiment of Foot. It did not become the South Wales Borderers until 1881. Of the soldiers present, 49 were English, 32 Welsh, 16 Irish and 22 others of undetermined ethnicity. The detachment of cavalry from Durnford's Horse who rode up to the mission station were members of the Natal native contingent. mainly composed of black riders rather than the local white farmers depicted in the film, who had survived the Battle of Isandlwana and had ridden to Rorke's Drift to warn and aid the garrison there. They were present during the opening action with the Zulus, but then rode off as they had very little ammunition for their carbines. Captain Stevenson is depicted as their head. In reality, he was leading the NNC infantry, who had already deserted. The approaching Zulu force was vastly larger, numbering 3,000 to 4,000 warriors. This Zulu force was the loins, or reserve of the army at Isandlwana, and none of them engaged during the battle. It was directed to swing wide of the British left flank and pass west and south of Isandlwana Hill itself in order to position itself across the line of communication and retreat of the British and their colonial allies in order to preserve their escape back to Natal by way of the Buffalo River ford leading to Rorke's Drift. This Zulu force was under the command of Prince Dabalumanzi, who was considered rash and aggressive, and this characterisation was born out of his violation of King Ketshwayo's order to act only in defence of Zululand against the invading British and not to carry the war over the border into enemy territory. The Rorke's Drift attack was an unplanned raid rather than any organised counter-invasion, with many of the Ulundi Corps Zulus breaking off to raid other African kraals and homesteads while the main body advanced on Rorke's Drift. At about 4:20 p.m, the battle began with Lieutenant Henderson's troopers stationed behind the Oscarberg, briefly engaging with the vanguard of the main Zulu force. However, tired from the battle at Isandlwana and retreat to Rorke's Drift, as well as being short of ammunition, Henderson's men fled for help-me-car. Henderson himself reported to Lieutenant Chard the enemy were close and that his men would no longer obey his orders. Henderson then followed his departing men. Upon witnessing the withdrawal of Henderson, Captain Stevenson's NNC company abandoned the cattle corral and fled, greatly reducing the strength of the defending garrison. Outraged that Stevenson and some of his colonial NCOs also fled from the barricades, a few British soldiers fired after them, killing Corporal William Anderson, who was the first casualty of the battle. With the Zulus nearly at the station, the garrison now numbered around 154 men. Of these, only Bromhead's company could be considered a cohesive unit. Additionally, up to 39 of his company were at the station as hospital patients, although only a handful of these were unable to take up arms. With fewer men, Chard realised the need to modify the defences and gave orders that biscuit boxes be used to construct a wall through the middle of the post in order to make possible the abandonment of the hospital side of the station if the need arose. At 4:30, the Zulus rounded the Oscarberg and approached the south wall. Private Frederick Hitch, posted as a lookout atop of the storehouse, reported a large column of Zulus approaching. The Zulu vanguard, 600 men, attacked the south wall, which joined the hospital and storeroom. The British opened fire when the Zulus were 500 yards away, not 100 as the movie states.
At 100 yards! Volley fire! Present!
Those British on the barricades, including Dalton and Bromhead, were soon engaged in fierce hand-to-hand fighting. The British wall was too high for the Zulus to scale, so they resorted to crouching under the wall, trying to get hold of the defenders' rifles, slashing at British soldiers with their assegais or firing their weapons through the wall. At places, they clambered over each other's bodies to drive the British from the walls, but were driven back. Chard realised that the north wall, under near constant attack from the Zulus, could not be held. At 6 p.m, he pulled his men back into the yard, abandoning the front 2 rooms of the hospital. The hospital was becoming untenable. The loopholes had become a liability, as rifles poking out were grabbed by the Zulus. Yet if the holes were left empty, the Zulu warriors stuck their own weapons through in order to fire into the rooms. Privates Horrigan, John Williams, Joseph Williams and other patients tried to hold the hospital entrance with rifles and fixed bayonets. Joseph Williams defended a small window, and 14 dead Zulus were later found beneath that window. As it became clear the front of the building was being taken over by Zulus, John Williams began to hack away and escape through the wall dividing the central room and the corner room in the back of the hospital. As he made a passable breach, the door into the central room came under furious attack from the Zulus. The corner room into which John Williams had pulled the 2 patients was occupied by Private Hook and another 9 patients. John Williams hacked at the wall in the next room with his pickaxe as Hook held off the Zulus. A firefight erupted as the Zulus fired through the door and Hook returned fire, an assegai striking his helmet and stunning him. Williams made a hole big enough to get into the next room, occupied only by patient Private Waters, and dragged the patients through. The last man out was Hook, who killed some Zulus who had knocked down the door before he dived through the hole. John Williams once again went to work, spurred on by the fact the roof was now ablaze, as Hook defended the hole and Waters continued to fire through a loophole. After 50 minutes the hole was large enough to drag the patients through, and most of the men were now in the last room, defended by Privates Robert Jones and William Jones. From here, the patients clambered out through a window and then made their way across the yard to the barricade. Private Waters and Beckett hid in a wardrobe. Waters was wounded and Beckett died of an assegai wound. Of the 11 patients, 9 survived the trip to the barricade, as did all the able-bodied men. According to James Henry Reynolds, only 4 defenders were killed in the hospital. One was a member of the Natal Native contingent with a broken leg. Sergeant Maxfield and Private Jenkins, who were ill with fever and refused to be moved, were also killed. The evacuation of the burning hospital completed the shortening of the perimeter. As night fell, the Zulu attacks grew stronger. The cattle corral came under renewed assault and was evacuated by 10 p.m, leaving the remaining men in the small bastion around the storehouse. Throughout the night, the Zulus kept up a constant assault against the British positions. Zulu attacks began to slacken only after midnight and ended around 2 a.m, and replaced by harassing fire from the Zulu firearms until around 4 a.m. By that time, the garrison had sustained 14 dead, 2 more were mortally wounded and 8 more were seriously wounded. Almost every man had a wound. They were all exhausted, having fought the better part of 10 hours and were running low on ammunition. Of 20,000 rounds in reserve at the mission, only 900 remained. Zulu has a famous scene before the final assault, where the defenders have a sing-off with the Zulus. This of course never happened, and though the song Men of Harlech features notably as the regimental song, it did not become so until later. At the time of the battle, the regimental song was The Warwickshire Lad. The Zulus were beaten once again, and it looked as though the battle was over. The Zulus did not sing a song saluting fellow warriors as depicted in the film, but departed at the approach of the British relief column. This inaccuracy has been praised for showing Zulus in a positive light and for treating them and the British as equals, but is also being criticised as undermining any anti-imperial message of the film.
They're taunting us. You
couldn't be more wrong. They're saluting you. They're saluting fellow braves.
At roughly 7 AM, an impi did appear, prompting the British to man their positions again. No attack materialised, as the Zulus had been on the move for 6 days prior to the battle. In their ranks were hundreds of wounded, and moreover they were several days' march from any supplies. Then, at around 8 AM, another force appeared. The defenders abandoned their breakfast and took up positions again. The approaching troops were the vanguard of Lord Chelmsford's relief column. After the battle, 351 Zulu bodies were counted, but it has been estimated that at least 500 wounded and captured Zulus might have been massacred as well. Having witnessed the carnage at Isandlwana, the members of Chelmsford Relief Force had no mercy for the captured or wounded Zulus they came across, nor did the station's defenders. Trooper William James Clark of the Natal Mounted Police described in his diary that, altogether we buried 375 Zulus and some wounded were thrown into the grave. Seeing the manner in which our wounded had been mutilated after being dragged from the hospital, we were very bitter and we did not spare wounded Zulus. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded to the defenders of Rorke's Drift, 7 of them being soldiers from the 2nd Battalion, 24th Foot, the most ever received for a single action by one regiment. This high number of awards for bravery has been interpreted as a reaction to the earlier defeat at the Battle of Isandlwana. This was chiefly done to draw the public's attention away from the great defeat at Isandlwana and the fact that Lord Chelmsford and Henry Battle Frere had instigated the war without the approval of Her Majesty's government. The movie Zulu is an all-time classic, but serves as a reminder of how movies can distort history. Though the basic premises of the film are true and largely accurate, but it is not a historical reenactment of real events. If you have enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you again next time. Until then, goodbye.